Again, it is thankful to be back with the church here at Brighton this morning to get to worship with you and to sing with you and to praise God. If you've got a Bible, I invite you to turn with me to Daniel chapter 4 as we continue this series of lessons from the book of Daniel. As I've been preaching through the first 3 chapters of Daniel, I've really heavily emphasized this idea of having godly resolve. And this morning, I want to step back away from this idea just a little bit and focus less on having resolve itself and more on what comes from that resolve and some of the things that happened as a result of the resolve of Daniel and his friends. And while we'll certainly come back to this idea as we move further into the book and see future events in the life of Daniel, I want to take a break here in Daniel chapter 4 because Daniel chapter 4 kind of changes its format from the rest of the book. So far, the first 3 chapters of Daniel have been somewhat of a narrative recorded by Daniel of the things that they experienced early in their life as Babylonian captives. But Daniel chapter 4 is a historical record written by Nebuchadnezzar himself, and it records Nebuchadnezzar's own experiences in the development of his faith. But before we get into chapter 4, I want to take a moment to briefly remind you of what we've already seen. If chapter 4 is Nebuchadnezzar's record of his faith, let's look back at what Nebuchadnezzar's already experienced and see what led to Nebuchadnezzar and this great moment of faith. If you were here last week, I laid out a pattern for you that we've been watching unfold throughout the book of Daniel. And I want to go through that one more time just by way of reminder. I'll summarize it so it's maybe a little bit more brief than it was last week. But we saw in chapter 1 of Daniel, as we're introduced to the resolve of Daniel and his friends, and how they refuse to defile themselves by eating the king's food. And we see in Daniel 1:17 through 21 that the result of their resolve is that Daniel and his friends are promoted by Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar is first introduced to the power of the God of Daniel. Well, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't really recognize the power of Daniel's God in Daniel chapter 1. This is kind of his first introduction. But then we move into chapter 2, and we see that Daniel's resolve and the resolve of his friends result in them turning to God in a time of need. And Daniel's friends are again promoted, and this time Nebuchadnezzar begins to recognize the power of God. And not only does he get to see God at work in the life of Daniel and his friends, he begins to recognize that it is God that's the source of this power. In chapter 1, he sees the result of God at work, but he doesn't really recognize that God's the one at work. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar begins to realize that it is God at work. And then in chapter 3, as Daniel's friends are thrown into the fiery furnace because they refuse to worship the golden image, and Nebuchadnezzar gets to witness these men walking around in the fiery furnace, and he sees the 4th person with them, which he describes as having the appearance of the son of a god. Nebuchadnezzar, once again, finally, for a 3rd time, gets to see God at work. And this time, not only does he get to see God's power in his ability to protect Daniel's friends, it's arguable that he gets to see God himself. And for those of you who were here last Sunday, we talked about who that 4th person in the fire might be, and that there are some that believe that that is the pre-incarnated Christ. Others say it's just an angel, but there is no denying that whoever that 4th person is that's walking around with them in the fire has some form of divine heavenly nature. So we've seen through the first 3 chapters a progression of Nebuchadnezzar's faith as a result of being witness to the power of God in the life of Daniel and his friends. And so as we've watched that unfold, as we've seen Daniel's resolve lead to Nebuchadnezzar being introduced to God, we get to chapter 4, which is the culmination of these first 3 chapters. Now, chapter 4, as I mentioned, is a historical record. It's not written as current events, but rather as a look back at the things that Nebuchadnezzar has experienced. So the events that take place in chapter 4 happen years and years and years before chapter 4 is recorded. It's a look back at Nebuchadnezzar's own history and his own past. So as we progress and we look into chapter 4, I want you to keep this in mind. Resolve is contagious. We've talked about having godly resolve, and we've talked about what that looks like. We've talked about some of the practicality behind it and the idea of trusting in God to get you through tough situations. And we've talked about how Daniel's resolve helped him to be bold in the face of trial and adversity. But I want to take the time today to discuss not necessarily how we have resolve, but what the result of our resolve is. And we've touched on this idea as we've talked about the result of Daniel's resolve in his own life, but I want to look at the result of our own godly resolve as it relates to those around us. What effect do we have on other people when we have godly resolve? When we're committed to living a life that is as free from sin as we can possibly manage? What happens? So I want us to remember that resolve is contagious. This entire study begins with a single statement in Daniel chapter 1 that Daniel had resolved not to be defiled. And I don't want to discredit Daniel's friends. It's very possible that Daniel's friends have resolve without Daniel's influence. It is possible that Daniel's the one focused on simply because he's the prophet, he's the one recording the books, and the friends just don't have as prominent of a role. But it does seem to me that the faith and the resolve of Daniel's friends, at least in some part, stems from Daniel's own resolve. It at least appears to me that Daniel is a powerful influence in the life of his friends. If you remember back to chapter 1, when the decree is given that they eat the food that would defile them, that decree affects Daniel and Daniel's friends. But Daniel's the one that brings about a solution to that. When the decree is made in chapter 2 that the wise men be put to death, that decree affects Daniel and his friends. But Daniel's the one that brings about resolution to that. So while it is certainly possible that the way the biblical narrative is written is just because Daniel is the prophet, it at least appears to me like Daniel seems to be the leader of this group. But even if you take the view that Daniel's friends have resolve independent of their relationship with Daniel, you cannot deny that their resolve has an impact on Nebuchadnezzar. We see that Nebuchadnezzar has a growing faith as he makes the statement in Daniel chapter 2 that the God of Daniel is God of God and Lord of Lords. And then at the end of chapter 3, when Nebuchadnezzar makes the decree that they are servants of the Most High God and that their God was far above anyone else. So we've seen how contagious the resolve of Daniel and his friends have been. And chapter 4 is the ultimate result of that. So as we look at the text, let's look at the first 3 verses of Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4 opens with a decree of faith by Nebuchadnezzar. The text says, King Nebuchadnezzar, to all the peoples, nations, languages that dwell in the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. What an interesting section of Scripture. Here we have a Babylonian king recognizing Yahweh, recognizing the God of heaven, the one true God. And he talks about all the signs that God has given to him. And think about what Nebuchadnezzar's seen. In chapter 1, he's seen Daniel and his friends and how they excel far above all of the other young wise men that they were associated with, that they had been trained with. For the last several years, Daniel and his friends have received the same education as these other gentlemen. And yet Daniel and his friends are far better. Nebuchadnezzar has been able to see God's influence in the life of Daniel. But perhaps he might have overlooked that in Daniel chapter 1. Maybe it wasn't all that impressive to him at the time, because certainly Daniel and his friends had excelled, but sometimes there are gentlemen who just seem to be prodigies. There are some men that just, for whatever reason, they have a sharp mind, and they just, maybe it's good genetics, maybe it's just their upbringing or their tenacity, I don't know. But there are some times where there are just some people who are apparently better than others. Maybe they're smarter or they're stronger. So for Nebuchadnezzar, maybe it's not that impressive that Daniel and his friends are so wise. I could understand Nebuchadnezzar not necessarily recognizing God's hand. But then you get to Daniel chapter 2, and Nebuchadnezzar gets to hear Daniel tell him what his dream was and give the interpretation. And while Daniel and his friends have certainly outperformed in the past, there is no denying in this case that there is something about Daniel that extends beyond simply being genetically gifted or smart. There is some kind of divine influence, and Nebuchadnezzar realizes that. And then you get to chapter 4, and you see Daniel's friends in the fiery furnace. And it doesn't matter how smart you are, how strong you are, you can't survive that without God's help. Perhaps a skeptic could look at Daniel chapter 1 and say that Daniel's friends are just gifted. And perhaps a skeptic could look at Daniel chapter 2 and say that they must have had some kind of insider information. The reason that Daniel interprets the dream and nobody else can is because maybe Daniel has spies, or maybe he's bribed somebody. But you cannot look at Daniel chapter 3 and deny the power of God in the life of Daniel and his friends. Nebuchadnezzar can't look at the events in chapter 3 and deny the existence of God. So Nebuchadnezzar has been very blessed to have received many great signs and wonders from the God of heaven. And as we look at chapter 4, we're going to see that he gets even more signs and even more opportunities to see the might and the power of God as a result of the resolve of Daniel and his friends. But what a powerful moment this is, that a heathen king recognizes God. You know, as I think about my own study of this text, I've approached this text as a Christian, and under the assumption that if you're sitting here in this auditorium, you believe to some extent in the existence of God. And so I've approached the text with that understanding. And so for me, it's easy to see the power of God in the text because I believe in God. But I want to remind you who Nebuchadnezzar is. Nebuchadnezzar is not a Christian. He's not even a Jew. He's a polytheistic pagan and a king of Babylon. And he recognizes Yahweh. He recognizes the power and the supremacy of our God because of the influence of Daniel and his friends. Because he gets to see the result of Daniel's resolve. So chapter 4 opens with Nebuchadnezzar recognizing the God of heaven and realizing all the signs that God has shown Nebuchadnezzar. And as if all the signs throughout the first 3 chapters of Daniel are not enough, remember that chapter 4, being a historical record, is going to record more facts, more accounts that occurred before the writing. And so he's about to get to see another sign, and perhaps the greatest sign yet. So as we move out of the first 3 verses, and we see an interesting story unfold. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to read the entire chapter word by word, verse by verse. But I encourage you to go home and to look at Daniel chapter 4. It's a really interesting story. It shows us a lot about the way the God of the Old Testament operates. It's a lot of symbolism. And while I've tried really hard to focus more on the practical aspect of the text of Daniel, I don't want to get so caught up in the symbolism of Daniel 4 that we miss the point that we're trying to make here. But it is an interesting read, and I encourage you to look at it sometime in your own study. But for the sake of our lesson, I'm just going to summarize. The story in Daniel chapter 4 goes like this. Nebuchadnezzar is relaxing in his palace, and everything seems to be going good. He's in a time of peace and prosperity. He's doing well. But then he has a dream which seems to concern him. And bless his heart, Nebuchadnezzar has had it rough when it comes to his dreams in the book of Daniel. Perhaps Nebuchadnezzar needs to be on some kind of sleeping medication because for whatever reason, he keeps having these wild dreams that cause him all kinds of anxiety. They make no sense at all. And he keeps having to call these dream tellers in to come and interpret the dream. And chapter 4 is no different. Chapter 4, we see Nebuchadnezzar's second dream. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that begins to trouble him. So he calls after all of his magicians and conjurers, his Chaldeans, his diviners, and his dream tellers. And once again, just as we saw in chapter 2, they're unable to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Do you remember chapter 2? Do you remember the dream about the statue? And how Nebuchadnezzar tells all of his enchanters and diviners and dream tellers to tell him what the dream is and then interpret it? You remember that they weren't able to do that, but Daniel was? If I was Nebuchadnezzar, I think when I got this second dream, my first call would have been to Daniel. That would make sense to me. In my experience, if I go to somebody for help with something and they're unable to do it, and then I go to somebody else and they are able to do it, I don't go back to the first person, I go to the second person. But for whatever reason, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't do that. He goes to his own Babylonian dream tellers, and maybe Daniel's unavailable. We'll give Nebuchadnezzar the benefit of the doubt, but for whatever reason, once again, these men are not men of God, and therefore they are unable to interpret the dream that God has given to Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar calls Daniel in what must have been an aha moment as he remembers Daniel's past success in interpreting dreams. And Daniel is able to interpret the dream. And the dream's full of a lot of symbolism, but essentially what happens is that Nebuchadnezzar is depicted as a great tree, which in the Old Testament is a symbol of wisdom. And while it's an odd revelation, essentially what it boils down to is that God is warning Nebuchadnezzar that while Nebuchadnezzar thinks he's a great and wise man, God is about to strip away Nebuchadnezzar's wits, to strip away his mental faculties. And Nebuchadnezzar will be forced to live as a beast of the field and to eat grass for a period of 7 years. And it's a really odd section of Scripture that doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense at first. And Daniel will give the interpretation of the dream, but and he'll begin to plead with Nebuchadnezzar to change his ways, to humble himself and not be so prideful, to stop neglecting the God of heaven and to turn to God. But Daniel's pleas will fall on deaf ears. Nebuchadnezzar will ignore Daniel and go back to his normal daily routines, and about 12 months will pass by, and nothing seems to happen. After 12 months, I can't help but wonder if maybe Nebuchadnezzar's like, Daniel must have just been wrong like the rest of them. It's been 12 months, nothing bad has happened, it's going to be all right. And then one day Nebuchadnezzar's out walking on his roof. I find it interesting that he's on his roof and he's looking out over his kingdom and observing his kingdom. And this seems to be something that Old Testament kings just did. If you remember back to 2 Samuel, do you remember where David is when he first notices Bathsheba? He's out walking on his roof observing his kingdom. For whatever reason, this seems to be what Old Testament kings do, and it never ends well. I want to tell you that anything you do out of pride probably will not end well. And that's exactly what's going on here. In 2 Samuel, David is out walking about on his roof, looking at his kingdom. And if we know anything about David, he struggles with pride at times, and it leads to sin. Certainly Nebuchadnezzar is struggling with pride in this moment because he looks out over all of his kingdom. And notice what he says. In verse 30, King Nebuchadnezzar says, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power, as a royal residence for the glory of my majesty?" He's standing out on his rooftop. He looks out over the kingdom of Babylon. He has a moment of pride where he says, "Look at all the great stuff that I've built for my glory and my majesty. Look how great and powerful I am." And in that moment, Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream comes true. A voice comes from heaven, the voice of God, and he tells Nebuchadnezzar, "The kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will." Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of the heaven, so his hair grew as long as the eagle's feather, and his nails were like birds' claws. Here's Nebuchadnezzar's 4th sign from God. He's seen all these signs that were given to him through the life of Daniel, and now he gets a direct sign from God. God says, "Nebuchadnezzar, since you have been so prideful, since you think that you built this kingdom and that all of this belongs to you, I'm going to take it all away. And I'm going to show you just how insignificant you are on your own. I gave this kingdom to you, and I can take it away and give it to someone else." That's the message of God to Nebuchadnezzar in this moment. Daniel's plea with Nebuchadnezzar fell on deaf ears, and so Nebuchadnezzar suffers the punishment of his failure to heed Daniel's advice. And as I think back on this story, I'm looking at what ends up happening is that Nebuchadnezzar will go through these 7 periods of time. And at the end of these 7 periods of time, we're told that he will look up to the God of heaven and God will restore his wits to him. And Nebuchadnezzar will have his kingdom returned to him and his wisdom. And his response at the end of the chapter is one of praise. The chapter ends with another section of praise, and we're told that Nebuchadnezzar raised his eyes towards heaven, his reason is returned to him, and so he blessed the Most High God and gave praise and honor to him who lives forever. And notice what he says in verses 34 and 35.
At the end of the day, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth account as nothing, but he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" Ultimately, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom will be returned to him, and his response will be to praise God. And the chapter ends in verse 37, which reads, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and honor the King of heaven, for all of his works are true, his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride."
Remember who Nebuchadnezzar is. Not a Christian, not even a Jew. A pagan, a polytheist, meaning that he doesn't believe in one God, he believes in a whole pantheon of gods. And he's a Babylonian king. And I think back over the last 3 chapters, and I reflect on the stories that we've looked at and talked about. And my conclusion is this: resolve is contagious. Daniel's resolve had an impact on his friends. When Daniel's friends joined Daniel in his resolve, these 4 men stood out in a way that led a heathen, pagan, Babylonian king to God. And remember what brought Daniel and his friends into Babylonian captivity in the first place. Israel has so greatly sinned against God and grieved God that God has turned his back on them and allowed them to be carried away in captivity. If only Israel had recognized God the way Nebuchadnezzar did, perhaps they would not have been carried off into captivity. But unfortunately for Israel, and fortunately for Nebuchadnezzar, that's not what happens. And they do get carried off into captivity. And Daniel and his friends have an opportunity to influence Nebuchadnezzar and to shine their light in such a way that the king came to know their God and to recognize his power and his authority. And I think about where we stand today in the world around us. I got to be honest, the world around us looks a lot like Babylon. The world around us no longer serves the God of heaven, but chooses a whole pantheon of idols. And we claim that we're so smart and so much more advanced than these ancient civilizations. And we almost look down on them with distaste for choosing to serve carved images. And we think we're so intellectually great. The world at least does. But they've done the same thing. They've replaced carven images with social justice, with the almighty dollar, with all of these other things that they've chosen to put before God. And whether you're serving the gods of Babylon or the gods of modern America, the reality is that the world has turned their back on the God of heaven and has chosen to serve idols instead. I know as a Christian in 2023, I relate a lot to Daniel and his friends. I know what it's like to have the world around you seek to strip away your identity. I know what it's like to be persecuted because I choose to live differently and to stand out in the crowd. And as I look at the world and see how it relates and how it compares to Babylon, and I look at myself and see how my Christian walk relates to that of Daniel and his friends, I think about what would happen if I chose to have the resolve of Daniel and his friends. If 4 men who chose to stand out could soften the heart of a heathen king, imagine what the church can do. Look at your board over here. Look at how many you had in attendance last Sunday. 66. 66 men and women gathered together in this building last Sunday. Imagine what those 66 people could do if every single one of them chose to live a life of resolve like Daniel and his friends did. Brothers and sisters, I really think that is the church here at Brighton. In my limited time here at Brighton, I've been very impressed with the kindness and the hospitality that's been shown to my wife and I. I've been constantly impressed by each and every one of you. And I've talked to other people in the area that know of the Church of Brighton. And everyone has nothing but praise to give on your behalf. That's who you are. And I'm glad to be able to stand up here and to share that with you today. You guys have an opportunity to shine a light in your community, just like Daniel and his 4 friends did. And if Daniel and his 4 friends could soften the heart of a pagan king, imagine what the church here at Brighton can do in this community. Imagine what the church as a whole could do in this country and in this world. All it took was 4 men choosing to stand out in the crowd. Unfortunately, we seem to have handicapped ourselves. As I talk to people in the church, I hear a lot of people treat the world as if it's already lost, as if it's already too far gone. People talk about just how corrupt and how sinful the leaders of our nation are, and they act as if it's too far gone. And then I read the book of Daniel, and I look at our world versus the world that Daniel was living in. And I look at the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, and I read some of the charges that are levied against the nations of their time. And I read about cult prostitution and child sacrifice. And I think to myself, if the king of a nation that was involved in things like that could be converted, if Israel, who was involved in things like that, could be forgiven and eventually brought out of captivity, why do we think that our country can't? Why do we think that our world can't change? Why have we given up? Brothers and sisters, I think you can be like Daniel and his friends. I think you can have the same impact that Daniel and his friends had if you're willing to recognize the power of God. Because remember who Nebuchadnezzar attributes power to. Chapter 4 ends in verse 37 with Nebuchadnezzar saying, I praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. God is able to humble those who walk in pride. God is able to soften the hearts of those who are living in sin. As I read the book of Daniel, I read about 4 men who changed the world. And maybe they didn't convert all of Babylon. Sure, Israel still had its problems, but they softened the heart of a heathen king. You understand the significance of a pagan, a polytheist, recognizing the supremacy of Yahweh God? A man who lives in a culture and was raised in a culture and is king of a nation that believes in a whole pantheon of gods, saying, no, there's one. There's one God. And he's the one that humbles men. God can humble the hearts of sinful people. And he's chosen to do that through the church and through the influence that the church has. So we've talked a lot about this idea of resolve and the situations that Daniel and his friends faced and how their resolve helped them overcome these situations. And the reason these situations that this is so important that we have resolve is because resolve is contagious. Certainly resolve is vital in our own walks with Christ. And certainly we cannot make it to heaven without having godly resolve. But having godly resolve is about more than just me. It's about more than just my walk with God. It's about my ability to influence the world around me. Brothers and sisters, what a privilege it is to get to be the lens through which the world sees God. What a privilege it is to get to wear that name Christian and to get to have the opportunity and the blessing to show the world around us God through our actions. So as I bring my lesson to a close, I want to start by issuing you the same challenge that I've issued you the last 3 times I've spoken. I want to challenge you to resolve not to be defiled by things of this world. But this time I issue you a secondary charge. Not only are we going to resolve not to be defiled by things of this world, but I want you to resolve to be a light in your community and to live in such a way that those around you see God. God was able to place Daniel and his friends in the presence of Nebuchadnezzar, and through that situation, they were able to convert Nebuchadnezzar and to show him the God of heaven. God has placed each and every one of you in a similar situation. Maybe you're not in the presence of a king, but I know some of you, I've talked to some of you, and some of you work pretty high up in your various fields of employment, which means you get to have an influence on your boss and on your coworkers. I know one of our sisters works with the county courthouse, which means you get exposed to some of the leaders in your community. God has placed each and every one of you, whether it be through school or work or whatever your daily life is, he's placed you in a situation where you have an opportunity to make a significant impact in the life of a significant person. Brothers and sisters, our world is not too lost. God is still looking to humble sinful people. I'm a student at Bear Valley because I believe that firmly. I believe that God is still looking to save souls. And he's chosen to do that through the church and through the example that we set. And I truly believe that if each and every one of you will choose to live that lifestyle once you leave this building, then you can do that. It's easy to wear the name Christian when you're in this room. It's easy to live faithfully when you're in this room. The temptations that we face in everyday life seemingly disappear when we walk through those front doors. But that's not always the case outside. Your example has an impact in this room in your ability to influence your brothers and sisters, but it also has an impact out there as you have an opportunity to influence the world around you. So as this morning, I want to challenge you to live in such a way that influences the world around you. With every decision you make, choose to live in such a way that shows others God through you. Because as we discussed last week, if you do have that godly resolve, you will stand out. And as we've seen this morning, there's power in standing out. Resolve is contagious. So bring my lesson to a close. I recognize that this has not been a particularly evangelistic sermon. And what I mean by that is that I recognize that my message this morning to you has not been anything faith-changing as far as pricking your heart and convincing you that you need to come to Christ. That's been my goal in past sermons. We've talked about the need to have resolve and devote our lives to Christ, but that's not been my message this morning. My message this morning has been more about sharing our faith with our brothers and sisters and with the world around us. But I do recognize that it is important that we offer an invitation and that you know that the church here wants to help you. It's important to understand that Daniel's resolve first was shared with his friends. So if there's any of you here this morning that are wavering in your resolve, we want to share our resolve with you. If there's anyone here that needs to put on Christ in baptism, we want to be able to do that. We want to help share our resolve with you so that you can in turn share it with others. Maybe you've done that. Maybe you've been baptized, but you find that you've struggled and you've wavered in your resolve. The invitation's the same this week as it was last week and the week before that. God still wants to forgive you. He still is looking to soften your heart. And if there's anything that we can do for you this morning, any needs you have, please let us know as we stand and sing.